Anna Khachiyan, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
That generation of I guess it's Gen Xers, right? Eric and such, they belong to a time when it's okay to be informed on racial and ethnic minutiae. Now, if you know you're doing race science and you're like a total white nationalist freak,
yes,
and must be scrubbed from the discourse.
For context, for the audience, I was like, "Is it Khachiyan? Is it Khachiyan?" And we're trying to be respectful, but as Anna points out, by being aware of that itself these days is a bit of a problem. Which is a great intro, I guess, to all of this. This is the same thing we've been asking everybody on since the election. What's your general reaction to the news? Joe Biden, president-elect, Trump, lost, but like barely. Obviously, you've got all the defund the police talk, who's to blame, all of that. Where do you fall on this? What do you think?
Well, what's the deal? I kind of checked out. Is Joe Biden now officially president-elect, or is it still contested? Who knows?
The electors haven't technically met, so
December 14th is the actual date. That's the actual date on which he will officially be president-elect. Anyway, the reason I'm being more confident in saying that is because I've been covering these lawsuits. And honestly, they're just completely bullshit. I mean, basically, we each one after the other, and I'm willing to hear it out. I just, every single one that's been happened in court has been dismissed at that point. So what I'm trying to focus on more is the county level stuff, and obviously the takes are flying around. Either the GOP is the ascendant working class party, or actually, Abigail Spanberger is the one blaming AOC, who's actually Black Lives Matter, save the Democratic Party. So yeah, I'm really curious where you fall on this.
I think I'm like everybody. I think you guys said this on one of your episodes. I'm trying to paper over my great disappointment with a general sense of apathy and indifference. I'm fairly indifferent ultimately to who wins this particular election. There is, I have to admit, something deeply, deeply demoralizing about Joe Biden becoming president. The return of the neolib consensus. I can understand why people were fired up and galvanized and thrilled by someone like Barack Obama. I don't understand Joe Biden. I think it feels, fake and manufactured.
The thing is, I'm not quite sure anyone was truly fired up about Joe Biden. Maybe there's some weird corner of Northern Virginia or sort of the Westchester County, but I just think most people were fired up by how much they hated Trump. And they'd be pretty honest about that. I don't think there are any Biden stands sort of hanging out there.
Right.
Well, there was, so I live in New York, and there was people in the street screaming about, cheering for Biden, which I thought was also completely bizarre and out of touch. I think people just are not in touch with themselves and their own feelings. Michael Tracy tweeted the other day that the key difference between Democratic and GOP claims of election fraud is that the Democratic claims get amplified eagerly by every organ of the mainstream establishment. Hence, you have something like 2016, and conversely, the GOP claims are subject to a barrage of disclaimers and censorship, declaring them to be authoritatively false. In my mind, look, the real issue is not Biden versus Trump specifically, or Democrats versus Republicans in general, but the fact that one side clearly owns and controls the ideological meta-narrative, the pulleys and levers of ideological conditioning.
Yeah.
This to me, not which flavor of neolib gerontocrat sits in the Oval Office, is what I think must be confronted and contested for any of us to have a chance, which by which I mean a future.
I saw your tweet. Yeah, I saw your tweet on this. I thought it was pretty profound. It's something that we've talked a lot here on the podcast, in reference to Wes Yang's successor ideology and in terms of what exactly is coming next, and how one party, or not even one party, when one group of people, an elite substructure or whatever, is controlling this meta narrative, the battle over that is the most important thing. And I guess I want to get this out of the way because I saw the other tweet that you'd sent on this, which I thought was hilarious, is you were like, these people, keep coming at me these like the people keep are like, when is Anna gonna be, just gonna come out and be on the right? And you were like, how about we just, talk to the messenger? And so since I actually literally get to talk to the messenger, I have that. What do you think that critique of the meta narrative, how is that not right wing? Because that's how it's being described. How do you kind of see yourself within this battle, as you put it? What do you think?
I feel like for 4 years now, I felt like the IKEA monkey trapped in like the revolving doors of liberal ideology, looking pathetically out in my little shearling, listening to people like melt down and hyperventilate about Trump and how uniquely bad he is, how much of a Nazi and autocrat. That's not plausible. It's not borne out by observation or experience. I don't think he was a particularly bad president. I don't think he was a particularly good one either. But, as everyone from Eric Weinstein to Glenn Greenwald, and they've had some kind of intellectually adversarial relationship in the past, as I understand it, have pointed out, he's a fairly bog standard neoliberal president. And right. I had a person the other day, an affluent white suburbanite, tell me that like what most bothers them about Trump is how racist he is. Like, what are you talking about? How does this concern you? You can tell that people are kind of lying through their teeth, but yet don't know it, in the sense that, like, I understand being touched by injustice and racism and that sort of thing, but I think it's a proxy for other kind of psychological forces, for the fact that, on the whole, it's a very low stakes, no goals game for like the affluent white suburbanites who voted somebody like Biden into office, because, they never have to confront any kind of realities. They never have to confront the realities that Trump on the whole has probably not been so bad for them. And I really appreciated, Eric giving me a shout out on, a couple of episodes back while also pronouncing my name correctly. So I'm going to name check him back for something that he said on that episode, which is, Trump is an expert on trolling the left by kind of calibrating his statements in such a way that the left then fills them in by connecting the dots. The left basically supplies the connections, and then the right points out that a lot of it was done inferentially, and he called this like the dress for politics. And Trump, I think, sounds or says things that sound like revolting on purpose because he wants to produce this inferential short circuit so that he can prove himself and his base right about kind of the so-called radical left.
So, something I love when people do is when they say something that pisses off both ends of our audience from different directions. So I want to go to the point about Trump being sort of standard neoliberal, because if you are left-wing, obviously that's offensive, because you're not even left-wing. If you're center-left, you're going to say, what are you talking about? Children in cages, Mexicans, various sort of statements you can
China,
pick up.
Yeah.
But if you're on the right, you'd say, wait, he's not neoliberal at all. He was an immigration restrictionist in a really serious way, like the H-1Bs, at least the idea of the border wall, the refugee numbers, the Muslim ban. You have the way that he approached free trade, right? The trade war of China is not something that anyone would have sort of done. Obviously, you could critique him on his foreign policy rhetoric, but no new wars is actually a real thing. So what is it about Donald Trump that's neoliberal to you?
I'm nothing really, or not as much as the previous five guys. But again, you have to pay lip service, right, to this kind of like dominant liberal ideological narrative. It's like on my podcast, I was talking about an op-ed Yanis Varoufakis wrote for The Guardian, where he brought up this really salient point about how if and when Biden gets elected, we don't actually want a return to normalcy. We don't want to go to sleep again. And he had to couch and cushion this with these kind of caveats and qualifications about what a bad, horrible guy Trump was. So I think, like, you kind of got me there, because I think, like, on balance, Trump is probably less bad, and I'll stand by this, I'll die on this hill, less bad than the previous five presidents. Just like in terms of like I think he was, too fat and lazy, frankly, to be much of a serious ideologue.
So this is why Sagar opened with the whole question of
Yeah.
like, when are you going to come out on the right? So what separate from the president's weight and sort of various issues, what is it about Trump ideologically or policy wise that you haven't liked? Right. So I could sort of see the directions where you'd be happy with, at least where he was pointing. What did he do that you didn't like?
I think most of his presidency was sort of a missed opportunity, right? To really kind of cordon off power or take power or meaningfully kind of change the consensus or the status quo. I'm not a policy nut, and I'm not like an economics expert, so I'm like mainly like looking at the aesthetics of it. But I think like I don't know how practicable or reasonable it is, but I think Trump could have really. There was a brief blip of time where he could have addressed some of the concerns that people in the country have very seriously. Especially like the healthcare stuff, the pharma stuff. Me personally, if I was in office, I would tackle factory farming first, because that's such a nexus of all of our social and economic woes and ills, right? But I think like if you look at the situation, I want to get to this later because, I guess we're going to talk about kind of how much the elites suck and kind of the decline of the quality of life.
It's coming.
But think about why we have somebody like Trump in the first place. Well, because, Presidents Reagan and Bush Sr. and Clinton sold out our economy, which then practically invited Presidents Bush Jr. and Obama to plunge us into like a series of endless wars to compensate for the lack of an economy, right?
And this is an interesting point where you talked about aesthetics, and this is something you and I had once connected on, and I think it's something that I want to tease out, and I don't yet know how to think about it. Which, because I agree with you, I think the aesthetics of coronavirus is the perfect thing for me, which is that Trump. The whole, 1/3 of the country only trusts Trump on coronavirus, but he didn't do all that bad of a job relative to all of Western Europe or like many of the rest of the world. Or look at Cuomo, right? Like Cuomo like condemns like old people to death, not from his own fault, but like he still did it. And he still got like a 70% approval rating, right? Like in New York. And I think about the aesthetics of Trump and like how much that actually ended up mattering, not just in Corona, but like for his entire presidency. What do you think that says about politics in general when... look at Biden. Like, all the guy has to do is wear a damn mask. And, like, that was probably a huge part of why he's going to be president. And, that's something that's, like, not ideological. It's purely aesthetic. What do you think that you can ascribe that to?
Ascribe what to? The kind
just
of...
that desire for the, like... I don't even know what it is. Here we're talking about competence aesthetics. But, in general, like, the role of aesthetics in politics... and what it says like about us and the things that we want really out of our leaders, as much as I think and I want policy to matter.
Yeah, I want policy to matter too, but frankly, speaking from like the perspective of a woman and somebody who's not political, it's boring and tedious. Nobody wants to learn about like tax codes or tech regulation. And, I think those are probably the two biggest battles. Like, I want to know, I was listening a little bit to the Julius Krein episode. I like him, smart guy. I want to talk about how we can kind of put the kibosh on the runaway powers that the tech industry has. But, frankly, I think most people, it's a little over their head, certainly a little bit over my head. And I think the kind of aesthetic thing is something that Trump has certainly exploited and amplified, but he did not invent. First of all, Vladislav Surkov in Russia invented it. But, Trump, again, mainly exposes it, and then the media amplifies it. I think the media and the technocrats are just, share the blame with Trump, or maybe actually should shoulder more of it.
Yeah, I'm interested in how you described yourself as not being political, because if we're looking at what's so toxic about our environment, it's that everything inherently becomes political even when you don't want it to be. So how do you think of yourself as non-political? When you do a podcast that obviously talks about politics, we're on a political podcast. How do you think about that idea?
I mean, look, I'm a person who's basically interested in psychology and aesthetics. I'm a Lashian. And so...
And Q explain who Lash... We haven't talked about Lash on the podcast
yeah,
before.
we can. We'll get to this because I think there's a whole nexus of people. Ross Duhat being one of them, Michael Lind, even David Brooks. They're all kind of secret Lashians. I mean, I can get back to that. But, I'm interested in like what, Bret Easton Ellis calls politics like a theater of like sociology. That's what it is for me. I'm interested in what motivates human beings to act the way they do. And I came to this because I was really disappointed and grossed out by like Me Too feminism and the kind of lies women tell themselves to deny themselves their own agency and power. Yeah, I mean, I personally, I started getting into politics out of necessity, not out of interest necessarily.
So because other people weaponized art and, everything into politics, you inherently had to become political.
Yes, yeah. And look, Zizek has a really great point about this. He has two great points, by the way. The first one that he made on our podcast about how, the obscenity of Trump really lies in the fact that it's not that he lies, it's that he tells the truth. In a way that, in polite society among adults, it's not customary to do so. So his obscenity is not actually being a liar, it's being a truth teller. And the other great point he made is that, we make a big deal about politics becoming an entertainment industry, thanks to guys like Trump. But I think the flip side is a lot more dangerous. It's kind of art and culture becoming a kind of like a political warfare zone.
Right.
What's a truth that Trump tells that society sort of is rejecting, that the neoliberal elite that we're sort of talking about is rejecting?
Well, like, I think he's completely exploded kind of the seedy underbelly of establishment politics, revealed the kind of morality plays and empathy grabs of Democratic operatives as being completely disingenuous and self-serving.
Yeah, I remember he did once. It was like, he said something like, well, these generals are, going to go sit on these boards. And I mean, the defense press like freaked out. They were like, the insinuation that, some of our foreign policy is conducted so that people can cash out is the most unpatriotic and ridiculous.
Right,
and everybody was like, what are you talking about? Like, it's obviously true. It's like, we're not trying to smear everybody. Like, not every general is like a war criminal or like war, blood, whatever, beating the drum in order to get a job at Raytheon. But like, it is just true that like a huge amount of them end up working and lobbying in this in this industry. And I'm like, this is so fucking obvious to me. And they end up, like you were saying, just denying these outright truths. One of the things I've always seen with Trump too is that he does what the neoliberals will do, or like the more sophisticated people will do, but just like in a less sophisticated way. And so then like people will, graft onto it or whatever, and then it will become a problem. They'll try and point that out, but they're so unable to look at their own hypocrisy. I mean, I'm thinking here about like Trump. Remember the Trump Foundation? Everyone's like, oh, the Trump Foundation, like all this stuff. I mean, I just read the story about like the Biden cancer charity, which only paid out money to its staffers, and it didn't do it. It didn't donate any money to cancer charity. But like with Trump, he does that and then also commissions like a $10,000 portrait of himself to just like hang in his lobby. And it's like, he does the same thing, just like in a more obscene way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard people make the kind of analogy or like metaphor that America today resembles the Soviet Union in its last days, and I was born in the Soviet Union. I remember it faintly enough, and I certainly remember kind of the aftermath. And at this point, of course, on some level, this comparison has become like trite and played out, but on the other hand, there are certain things that ring true about it, namely that like on an aesthetic level, Trump is a very Russian president. He has the obscenity. He has the obscenity and vulgarity of a Russian bureaucrat from the last days of the Soviet Union. And not to mention that the whole kind of climate right now in the kind of left and liberal spheres feels a lot like Pavlik Morozov, like people snitching out their parents for voting Republican, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think, he's a great example. I talked about this a little bit with Eric. He's a great example of what we call stjob, which is like, a performative over-identification that's so extreme that it's impossible to know where somebody stands. In short, he's a troll. And, back to your question, Marshall, about like, what kind of truths does he tell? Well, my favorite truth that he told is that he's never seen a thin person drinking Diet Coke, The man has like
that's such a good that you're right. That actually is that's
As a
the one that
former
everyone
fat
had
kid
to
addicted
nod.
to Diet Coke. I am outraged by that statement. I'm outraged.
Actually,
so
Anna,
obvious.
I'm glad you brought up the Soviet Union, because something that came out in a lot of the polling, and we'll insert statement, exit polls are complicated, we'll hear more, but a lot of recent immigrants, especially in Florida, voted Republican or voted for Trump because of sort of the specter of socialism and sort of that idea. As I'm thinking about your background, you're sort of the opposite of that sort of story. Think of the whole, the Vietnamese people who fled out of the Vietnam War, and the grandparents are basically boomer conservatives, and the grandchildren are sort of DSA members, and this whole Twitter thing to it. But how do you think about that dynamic as in terms of the immigrant story and socialism, communism, that sort of part?
I mean, I'm very jaded and pessimistic about socialism, right? My parents were revolted, repulsed by socialism. I think they suffered tremendously under it. So, my feeling about it is like I'm sympathetic to all sides. Like I see what like young American kids who are drawn to this kind of momentum of like Bernie Sanders or AOC or someone. I see where they're coming from, and I'm sympathetic to it, but I think they're jumping the gun a little.
What
In
do you
what
mean by
way?
that? Yeah.
I mean, I think they're naive and they don't understand how power works in the real world amongst real
Yeah.
adults.
It's funny that you say that. I mean, I just saw Bernie, I think he was on Jake Tapper's show on Sunday, and he's like, I don't know anybody out there calling up defund the police. And I'm like, do you know your protege, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? And just so much of what we're talking about here is, and just to bring it back to kind of aesthetics and more, is that they're like kind of leaning into the worst caricatures that remind, as you said, like your parents, recent immigrants and others from these regimes. Something that Ross said on their podcast, which I thought was really important, because I thought the socialism sucks attack was really dumb. And, I'm on record and I was wrong about it. And one of the reasons why is because I thought that people were tying it to economics, right? But the truth was, and this is what Ross said, is that a lot of these recent immigrants just like tie it to the specter of like a transition in regime and just like statues coming down and chaos. And they're like, actually, like, chaos is terrible. I'm curious if you think that analysis and like dynamic is true, and like what, because then it seems to me then that socialism itself has an aesthetics problem. What do you think that is?
I don't know. It depends on what kind of socialism we're talking about.
Well,
I think
AOC, whatever. How a average American voter would understand it in the vein of like a Bernie and an AOC. I'm not saying that's correct, but like that's how they would see it.
I mean, I think that the primary problem of like socialist aesthetics as they exist now is that they're uncompelling and unsexy. In other words, these are people who are trying to normalize taboos instead of promoting them. They have the terms a little bit wrong. The minute that you normalize something, like sex work, for example, it ceases to have the kind of like seedy or gritty edge that people glommed onto it originally for. And, a lot of them are just basically, I think this moment's over, but a lot of them were like basically just reprising the kind of Soviet space dog aesthetics of the Soviet Union, which was fundamentally, like a revivalist and nostalgic movement. And like all nostalgia had no sense for it, had no actual experience with the thing that it was kind of fetishizing and nostalgizing. I mean, like Mark Fisher talks about this ad nauseum. I think he's probably like the best critic of these nostalgia complexes. But I think like on a more meaningful level, the problem with everybody that we talk about basically in this Twitter sphere is that everyone's a liberal. We're all liberals at the end of the day. You might be a conservative-leaning liberal or a left-leaning liberal, but we all basically believe in certain core tenets, like this myth of progress that basically takes the form, I think, of total belief in technological advance, in certain kind of human rights and morality-based appeals. So that's I think my bigger issue with kind of the socialist putsch is that it's not aesthetics. It's kind of the underlying unexamined ideology of it.
Huh.
So would you not describe yourself as a socialist then?
I mean, I don't describe myself as anything. I'm a nothing. I'm like a cipher. I'm a null and a void. I don't identify.
I gotta tell you, people project whatever they want onto you. They truly do. It's like right and left, socialist, anti-woke, apologist, whatever. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I've become kind of desensitized to it. I always remember what Vanessa Place said on our show, which is my critics are always right. It's up to them to project whatever kind of like meanings and significances they want onto me. I won't resist it anymore.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
just to go give Sakura a quick break. What about the original question, which you tweeted about, which is like, are you going to pivot to the right? The sort of thing that people are sort of critiquing in bad faith on Twitter. But what's your response to that question if you're asking it in an not in an interesting way, but in the correct way? Because something Sagar and I have noticed is that there just are a lot of people who are far more political than you in terms of their framing, who will put in their Twitter bio, former leftist or the left me. And all of a sudden they're just tweeting Trumpy shit and obviously are going for Patreon clicks. So how do you just think about that dynamic?
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to kind of articulate it in tangible terms. I don't subscribe to any of the labels. I think the labels are especially now more and more irrelevant. Saying you're left wing or right wing increasingly means, very little. Because we all know, like the kind of the left wing now is so far gone, has deviated so far from kind of the original, labor left, right? I don't have as good of a grip on what's going on in right-wing circles. I'm sure you guys probably have a better sense of that. But, I think that it is all kind of like aesthetic symbolism at this point.
Yeah.
And, my feeling about it to answer the question is like, if I was going to be right wing, I would have gotten a blonde weave and breast implants and a YouTube channel, and I would have been far more successful than I am now. This is small fries.
If we see you moving to LA, we'll understand
when
something's
you move
going
to LA,
on.
right? Yeah, if you need some Fox Booker contacts, I got you. I mean, here's a question I really have, which is that I can hear you. I think there's a lot of people on the right who do this cringe thing where they look for people on the left to like validate what they think is bad about like the others. I'm curious, for those people, what do you think is cringe about the right? Like what sucks about the right in America today?
That's a good question that I haven't really pondered excessively. I think my beef with right-wingers is that they're kind of victim mongers and empathy lords in their own right, even though they accuse kind of the left of being this way. They have their own identity politics, and they're equally ideologically possessed, just in the other way. There are, a lot of people now on social media making like claims about the electoral fraud that's going on, allegedly, and they're doing it in a frankly very militant and off-putting way. they could strengthen their case, I think, by being more moderate and explanatory to those of us who don't understand, like statistical models, for example, or like math formulas.
Graphs. Well, I think what's funny about what you're saying is that there are a bunch of people who I'm not going to name, who have been tweeting and dunking on the left for Russiagate and all of its excesses over the past 4 years. But and I should also add, these same people were saying Trump was going to win by 400 electoral votes. These are real people who are in DC and New York who are saying this. But the second that Trump lost in a very frankly explainable and legitimate way, they turned into complete sort of election truthers without any sort of evidence. And it just is incredibly frustrating. So I get and agree with your point about many people on the right aren't as different than the leftists who they're critiquing in the first place.
Yeah, again, I think this is the narcissism of small differences. The political denomination or orientation is liberal. The psychological type, as Lasch talks about it, is narcissist. And of course, people don't want to hear that because, everyone's always fishing for kind of evidence of like hypocrisy. I think being a truffle swine for hypocrisy, by the way, is like the lowest form of discourse. Like, we're all hypocrites and we're all liberals. Like, get a grip, people. But Lasch goes into this quite a bit, and I don't know if we should go into this on this particular podcast.
Let's do it. That's what I was going to say. Yeah,
because it's it's pretty lengthy and involved. But he talks about kind of how we live in a time of pathological narcissism, which should not be confused with extreme self-love or grandiosity. That often it is accompanied by feelings of extreme self-loathing, because of course narcissists depend on the very people that they resent for the integrity of their ego, right? They derive validation and affirmation externally from others, and they resent this. And I think like it's very interesting to see him being revived now by people like Ross Douthat and Michael Lind and David Brooks, like I mentioned, because you can see, I mean, I'm not accusing anyone of any kind of like cynical gambits here, but to those of us who are initiated, we read their work and we interpret it as an homage. But the fact is most people are not initiated. He's kind of a forgotten thinker. So, his ideas now look very fresh and novel.
I completely agree. It's fascinating. I kind of was one of those people. Like, I got Ross pilled, Ross put out that, and then I was like, oh, and then, if someone was like, you got to read Christopher Lasch. So I read Revolt. And I remember being like, how did he write this in the 1990s? He like called like the narcissism of like the managerial elite and more. And this is one of the things I really wanted to talk with you about, was about just like how much our elite sucks today. And I said this on Tucker's show first. And I said this on our podcast with Eric, is like, the problem I have is like, I'm not anti-elite. It's just that our current elite sucks and they produce subpar outcomes for themselves and for everyone else. And it's like, what kind of elite are these people? How did we end up this way?
Really, damn you, Sagar, because you should have waited for me to quote you.
Yeah.
And now you've gone and quoted yourself. But yeah, I wanted to make a point that was
narcissism.
Narcissism. Look at my PMC brain,
Yeah, but I mean, you look at, for example, what's going on with like the kind of internalized, implanted liberal ideology that we all carry around, and part of like liberal self-fashioning depends so much on those who are now in the mainstream continuing to see themselves as the underdog, hence the rise of this kind of Lashian narcissistic empathy politics. You see this, with like appealing the appeals to people that are emotional rather than rational, kind of on the basis of your relatability, which now more often than not is basically your adversity. Nowadays dramatizing your adversity is of course the only way that you make yourself look relatable. For instance, like AOC is the queen of this. She likes to bill herself as like this lowly former bartender from the barrio. She drops her makeup tutorial. She had that recent interview in the New York Times talking about how she almost quit politics because the higher ups in the party were bullying her so much. when she's obviously like their pledge and they're hazing her. And, you know, in Russian, we have this phrase, "Проверка на вшивость," which basically means a shit test, which is what she was undergoing. And, you know, like she and other members of the squad, for example, habitually tweet about how we must challenge kind of the institutional centers of power. And of course, they are the new institutional centers of power. That's what's so preposterous to me about the elites, is it's this constant rationalizing and deflecting of power. No, we're just the underdog. It's sort of like what I do, you know, on Twitter. I'm so dumb. I haven't read any books. Except I'm like an entertainer, not a politician. And, you know, and it's really irrelevant whether it's lost on them or it's a deliberate rhetorical strategy, because it works, you know, the same way. And I was thinking, you know, it's not just her or the squad. I don't mean to pick on them. You know, you saw Biden doing it during the 2020 debates when Trump was clearly invoking his troubled crackhead son Hunter, and he kept mishearing and harping on his dead war hero son Beau. You saw Hillary doing it every step of the way in both the lead up to and the aftermath to the 2016 election, right? Where she was packaging herself as kind of like a victim of sexism and misogyny, not to mention like, you know, these armies of like Russian trolls or whatever.
Right.
And I think that that's what's so, I guess, for lack of a better phrasing, disgusting and demoralizing.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that this stems from, and I think it was Michael Lind who I got this from, I don't remember, and he was talking about how the circle of meritocracy has made it such that they're convinced that they earned it when, you know, the old elite, so to speak, like, look, you know, there was a lot of problems in 1950s, 1960s, 1940s, all that. Okay, all that out of the way. But like, you know, there was like a noblesse oblige. Like, you know, I read George H.W. Bush's biography, and I'm like, this guy was like one of the youngest people. He signs the military, and he's like, I gotta go and I gotta serve my country and all of this. And he's like, and I obviously inherited this wealth, and I owe a debt to society, and like breathes it in his kids. Well, you know, it didn't really work out that well with kids necessarily, but it was like something that he like deeply believed. And again, I mean, this is something which I just think is completely missing and makes these people so hollow. There was a tweet I saw somebody was telling me about recently where this was a girl who was tweeting about like her high school ex-boyfriend who had just gotten married. And he had just gotten married, and he was like having a happy life. And she was like, you know, she's like, so funny, like just saw my high school boyfriend get married. Like, I live in New York, I own cool stuff, and I have an awesome job. She's like, I obviously won. And I just remember being like you won? Like, that's what winning means? Like today, like what's wrong with you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole different conversation, like on the kind of failures of feminism too, kind of the lies that we tell ourselves. But yeah, I mean, this is all, it's all very like bleak. And I feel like it's sort of like this kind of like personal, like making everything like look depoliticized and relatable. You know, for example, you know, if you go back to like the squad or something, I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm just like,
Just
you
riff.
know,
Yeah.
You know, you have this like, they've been branded or billed as like this uplifting, you know, departure from establishment politics, and they're very much in the kind of direct logical lineage of establishment politics. They're, you know, a direct extension of this liberal self-mythologizing that necessarily has to see itself as like an underdog to cope with the immense power that it in fact wields. And I think that this is like very much what Lash foresaw and was warning against. And, you know, as far as, you know, your comment about Michael Lind and Ross Duhat, that point I think was directly captured by him in Revolt of the Elites, which I believe is from 1994. I mean, we can go into that. It's very kind of symbolic and meaningful, Freudian for me, that Revolt of the Elites is published in the year that the GATT and NAFTA treaties go into effect, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, could we talk about money? Because
I'm Armenian and Jewish. I love talking about money.
Great. I'm Black and Jewish, so I don't really know what the stereotype is there, but we'll work it out. So the question here is, we're talking about how elites are sort of advancing this sort of idea. They think they're the underdog, but the answer to this is actually pretty straightforward, how they sort of reconcile this in their head, and it's money. So
Right.
I was making much of the point that you're making here with someone who used to run a very prominent, basically, I heard you on the podcast of Glenn Glean will refer to these tattletale journalists who basically go around she runs one of these organizations that basically holds brands hostage to get them to not advertise on Fox.
Puts a gun to their head and says, "Why are you supporting
yeah.
racists?" Right?
No. What they say is, why are you doing this? We're trying to help you, as they hold the gun to them.
right. Okay.
But basically, her point was, I don't have any power because I don't make that much money. I work at a nonprofit. So can you sort of talk about the idea that this sort of elite that we're talking about doesn't necessarily correspond with making six figures? AOC could both be a member of the political establishment, be at the Time 100, but also be a former bartender. How does that all work together? Because that's where I see people getting confused.
Well, I mean, this, I think, goes back to Michael Lynn's argument, right, that you guys so frequently cite about, and you know, you can bring in Peter Turchin here, kind of his elite overproduction thesis, coupled with like Lynn's horseshoe theory of class difference. I think somebody like AOC absolutely takes advantage of, and frankly, given the system, I don't blame her, of being, let's say, economically working class when she is in fact culturally middle class. There's a lot of mushiness, fudging of those two values that I think are very kind of meaningful. And in America, they're often made to disappear. And I'm used to like the Russian model where we're constantly diagnosing and parsing the minutia, like micro minutia of class warfare. But you take somebody like that, and I count myself in a similar position, right? We have virtually similar backgrounds. Socioeconomically, our dads died sophomore year of college. They both had kind of like fairly respectable and affluent white-collar professions. We were economically demoted to working in the service industry, and I think now somebody like her can leverage that into a political brand. Well, I was working class. I think that, I've said this before like a million times. I'm like Quentin Crisp. I repeat myself loudly and often. But the American left, it thinks that it's fighting a class war masquerading as a culture war. And in fact, it's fighting a culture war masquerading as a class war, because the American left is by and large made up of nice, educated, relatively affluent, mostly white people who resent and hate your average culturally working class, but now economically middle class, small businessman, proprietor, boat salesman, whatever.
Right.
So this is where, quick thing. This is where your question about cringy right becomes so important, because I could agree with everything you just said when you critique the left. But for many people, and we run into this problem with our sort of viewer question and answers, they'll hear this critique of sort of the center left establishment and say, okay, cool. So I'm now a right populist, not recognizing that if you actually look at most of the American right, yeah, it's true. They don't run Hollywood. They don't run the entertainment industry, but they're definitely not supporting the minimum wage increases that people get excited about. If I get one more question from someone who says they're on the right about how we could get universal health care from the right wing perspective, I will like punch myself in the face, because that's just not a thing. So how do we sort of critique the left without creating a phantom right that doesn't exist? Because that's what so many of the people sort of do here in soccer. You've seen this too. I'd love you to add your point on that.
Yeah, I see it all the time. No, I just want to hear your answer to that question. I think it's fascinating.
You have to repeat the question. How do we critique the left without playing into a caricature?
No, how do you critique center left world, elites, etc., without creating this false image for people that there is a right equivalent that's safe and open and something that's sort of ripe for the taking? Because it seems to me that that's what people never sort of do on it. And that's not what you're doing here, but too many people on Twitter say, do you hate the PMC? Yeah, they're terrible, so join the right, as if that's a thing that you can actually do.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I think that the way that you have to critique it I don't know if I can even answer that question adequately because again, I have such a poor grasp myself, coming from like this left liberal terrain of the actual right wing, outside of like people that I've met individually. But I think you have to be kind of brutally, ruthlessly self-critical, right? With where you yourself stand in this cosmos.
Oh, so I actually got a better way of framing this for you. People listened to your episode with Steve Bannon,
Yeah.
which I loved, was amazing.
Incredible,
And they think that that's the right. That's what I'm sort of talking about. People will listen to that
Gotcha,
episode of
gotcha.
Steve Bannon and say, oh, shoot, so there's this guy.
Yeah, and I'm like,
he
I
wants to
fucking
raise,
wish.
he wants to raise taxes, but he's also not woke. And they think that that doesn't exist. That's not real. So I think as I was listening to your episode this morning to prep, I was like, man, a lot of people listen to this episode, sort of like some dissatisfied fail son, and really got a just really inaccurate picture of what the other
What
side
the
of the
right
political
wing looks like.
Yes.
I mean, what we're talking about, I think when we talk about the actual right wing is basically like corporatist liberals, right? Who are libertarians who, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're right.
Because I'm like a fish out of water here, but it's, people who believe in kind of bootstrapping and personal responsibility as it existed during the Reagan age and who still believe in kind of like the reign of the small businessman. I mean, I think reality is going to catch up to those people too, because, I say this, somewhat ironically and somewhat in jest, but in my mind, the alternative, the inverse of something like Black Lives Matter is actually not like White Lives Matter or the even cringier Blue Lives Matter, but it's No Lives Matter. Because eventually neoliberal austerity gets to everybody. It gets to us all.
Defund us all is the real right wing position.
Yeah,
I want to get to something you said something so important that I have this goddamn debate all the time with the left about working class. What does it mean? I'm almost at a point where I don't even use it anymore.
I don't know what it means anymore.
I try to basically just make it like dividing line is 4-year college degree. In general, that's generally how you can approximate it. Because what you said is that you can be working class and culturally middle class if you look at it by income. In this way, I'm thinking about, or even upper middle class, I'm thinking about like a Vox writer who makes like $35,000, but writes like all these bullshit articles about, woke identity politics. It's like, you obviously are not working class. Like, sorry. But let's say you have like a plumber who makes like 90 grand and who lives in small town Georgia. I mean, economically, like he's not working class, but culturally, I mean, on the aggregate, very likely to be culturally working class. Like, I remember there's that great thing with Charles Murray where he asked people, like, what does the word Branson mean to you? And like, obviously, I'm like, oh, like Richard Branson, right? And like, if you answer that, you actually get -2 working class points because like the actual answer is Branson, Missouri, which is like the country music capital of America, which I'm ashamed to just say I didn't know until I took that quiz. But I guess what I'm trying to get at it is how do you think about that term working class? And again, I really want people to take away that cultural point that you made, which is that culture itself is power. It's not just derived from income itself.
Yes. I mean, didn't Andrew Breitbart say this?
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Politics is downstream.
Yeah.
Pour one out for that guy. I mean, again, you have to think about this in terms of the double horseshoe theory of Michael Lind. I think you have to decouple economic class from cultural class. Very often they're wedded. Increasingly, they're not. The left takes advantage of mystifying, obfuscating this distinction. So you have a bunch of people on the left who are like basically millennials, our age, who are highly credentialed, highly educated, over socialized, will insist until they're blue in the face about their working class bona fides. But of course, grew up. You can tell by their cadence, by the way that they, pause minutely to say to recite like a hip hop lyric. You can tell that these people are, culturally middle class.
Yeah.
I'm imagining a hellish test where we make someone read rap lyrics out to test whether. Or, I'm like, read the following 3 lines and see where you pause.
And like, I don't know how. I don't know. I really insist on this. I don't know how much more I can insist on it. I say this, I'm being a little bitchy and roasting people because I say this out of sympathy. I think it's, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think it's a disgrace that educated middle class people have to struggle in this country. I mean, is it not? But again, I'm always laughing at AOC because I think not because I have any personal beef with her, but because she's like a prime exponent of this. She doesn't sound like Jenny from the block. She sounds like, like Rebecca from Jewish summer camp, the kind of over enunciated, hyper literate cadence.
Or I think of this. Sorry, quick thing. Who I think of as the type of person who's in charge of the multicultural center at your school. Exactly. That's where the cadence comes in. That's where the speaking style comes in. And what's so frustrating is we're doing a lot of dunking here. I'm not just trying to dunk because everyone, I think those things actually do matter, and I actually don't have a sort of visceral opposition to identity politics in that way. But you should understand that if you're working at your school's multicultural center, if you're sort of operating in that sort of like Jenny from, summer school perspective, you're not exactly challenging power. You're not exactly upending the establishment in what you sort of do. And that's something that makes people so angry when you say that. And I was never prepared when I was talking about the person who ran the Liberal Justice Organization. I was not ready for how angry they got when I just made the point that, hey, just so you know, you have more cultural power with your ability to defund Tucker Carlson than a small business owner who makes $150K but went to a community college. And that's just so contradictory to the internalized narrative that it just causes a reaction.
Yeah, I think people get they get apoplectic, they get enraged when you bring this up to them. And my feeling has always been like, hey, there's no shame. Let's all like hold hands and jump into this abyss together and like parse it out. But it's like, the point of this whole empathy politics thing of always insisting on your adversity or your victimhood or your kind of like hard scrabble origins and this sort of thing is, of course, to make your ideological agenda seem unfalsifiable and therefore unassailable. Nobody can attack you because, what kind of a monster are you if you attack a woman, let alone a woman of color, And, we can argue with like Trump versus Biden or Democrats versus Republicans. I happen to think the distinction is pretty meaningless nowadays as far as the kind of establishment center is concerned. But who can argue with like voting or going green or being anti-racist, which, by the way, is subtly different from just not being racist,
Yes.
But will
profoundly different, actually.
Yes, but they will also collapse, mystify, obfuscate that distinction, right? And to kind of circle back on something I said earlier, I think it's a maneuver that works perfectly in our age, which is an age of like wild inferential thinking in which you graft, project, it's people on Twitter love, it's like their favorite word. You're just projecting, and this kind of wild inferentialism, when it's taken to its logical extremes, becomes conspiracy theory and paranoid thinking. But my beef with the kind of empathy politics that both sides now, I think, are exploiting. You look at somebody like Madison Cawthorn. I was telling Glenn Greenwald, excuse me, he's a perfect ID poll candidate for the right. Yeah. He's a hot blonde Chad who's wheelchair bound, and like a family man, right? But my beef with it is that is ultimately how spiritually short-sighted and uncharitable and miserly it is, because it's a zero-sum game and it's like a race to the bottom, and it's fundamentally manipulative and extortionate.
Yeah, I think the final thing I wanted to get with you here was something I thought about you during, I'm not sure if you saw it, this Macron interview with the New York Times that just came out yesterday. And one of the key points about France, right, is they've always resisted kind of like American hegemony, like cultural hegemony and more. And I'm like, it seems like the worst part about this is that we not only globalized our economy, we globalized our culture and exported this nonsense just like across the world. I mean, as somebody, obviously, you're deeply familiar with Russia, Armenia, and more. Like, how do you see that as one of the worst things that we actually ended up doing?
So quick thing, Sucker. I want to give a little more context on this story because I don't think everyone's caught up on the NYT paywall. So what happened is Sunday, we're recording this on Monday, an interview with President Macron where he talked about how the U.S. is American and British papers are critiquing his efforts to combat Islamism in France by saying it's racist, by saying he's not focused on equity, and then they're bringing this American BLM summer 2020 context into France, and he's pushing back against that. And we heard you, and you actually you made this really great point on Eric Weinstein's podcast where you're talking about how the most annoying thing we do is we take our racialized history, which is awful in a million different ways that we could name, obviously, in a different episode, but it exports it to other countries. So we're interested in how do you just think about that export and how the internet enables that and how we sort of can't think of these things outside of that weird globalization?
Well, there's a lot of parts to this. Number one, I mean, leave it to the French to make racism charming. They really have a talent for it. And also leave it to the French to combine traditionalism and neoliberalism.
Yes.
It seems like an impossible...
That is Macron, right? Like Jupiterian traditional neoliberal.
And
you have to respect it, though.
He's fighting a losing battle, but you have to commend him for trying.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Anna.
No. But yeah, I mean, I think it's alternately reprehensible and comical. And I think we know that the most kind of persistent ideologies are those that kind of successfully manage to package themselves as non-ideological, that appeal to basic human values and morals. It has to go down easy. And, I think the problem, I said this on my show before, and I think Amy Therese Laba said it on Twitter recently, all of these kind of progressive and woke tentacles of liberal ideology, of its industrial complex, anti-racism being the most prominent one, but also like anti-imperialism, climate change and stuff like that, depend on the continued existence of the very thing that they claim to oppose. You can't have anti-racism without racism, and you can't have Antifa without some constructed semblance of fascism. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's completely bizarre and awkward for kind of the American racial discourse to be transferred into countries that have no similar context or history. I mean, I thought it was super weird during the George Floyd protests to see entire protest movements being exported out to Amsterdam and Paris.
I was just thinking Amsterdam. I was like, Amsterdam?
Well, that
like
was the first one. Yeah. That was I was like, okay. And then you realize, going back to the No Lives Matter thing, you realize that really, George Floyd, as horrible and tragic as what happened to him, he's in some sense like a proxy martyr for the real reason people were coming out in droves, which is they were mourning the end of their own lives and prospects because of COVID and the subsequent lockdowns. And I think they were legitimately suffering, but they had to lend a kind of morally justifiable excuse to it or rationalize it somehow. I think this goes back again to the way that our elites deflect and rationalize their own power in exporting these sort of ideologies through media and academia primarily to the rest of the world. Because, Christopher Lasch talks about this, of course. The elites, our elites, are effectively now global elites, right?
Yes.
So the elites in Moscow and Berlin and I don't know, Shanghai have more in common with one another than they don't
So I'll wrap with this, and this isn't related to policy. It actually goes back to the aesthetic point we started with. You weren't what I was expecting. Sagar, you two have spoken. We've never sort of spoken.
Yeah.
And I'm just noticing that on a podcast, your sort of presentation is different than your presentation on Twitter. So like you're not being sarcastic. You're actually being like very, very nice. Not that you wouldn't be nice, but
am
I just
I
mean
more or less of a bitch?
no, wait, like I'm not gonna engage too hard, but no, you're genuinely like a very like friendly person, and I'm getting that through Zoom. But like your Twitter is like very sort of sarcastic and biting oftentimes. So as an entertainer, how do you just think about like the aesthetic presentation that you have, right? And everyone sort of performs in these spaces differently. And I'm just sort of noticing at least in terms of how I interpret it. How do you just think about that?
I don't really. I've never thought about it. I just express myself the way that I like would ordinarily. I'm a very shy and timid person, and the reason I started a podcast was literally to get over my social anxiety. That's like all there is to it. The way that I tweet is not intentional or branded in any way. I think again, this goes back to like this kind of export of like monoculture across the globe. It's just the way that I think Russian people and Russian immigrants communicate with each other. My mom is very brusque and bitchy, and I think like every time she's like met one of my boyfriends, they've like cowered away with their tail between their legs because they think she's being mean to them, and she's not. I think it's a kind of like that sort of thing that a lot is lost in translation, and now that it's become basically criminal and pathological to discuss like racial and ethnic and cultural differences. It becomes more and more hopeless every day for me to like try to communicate why I am the way I am, which is fine. You know, I'll like take it on the chin. But yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that. But
yeah, I was no, that's fair. I was just curious.
That's good.
But it's I mean, it's depressing. I think just if I may go back to kind of this point that Sagar you made about not being kind of against elites in theory or in principle, but being against our current crop of elites because they suck. I think that's what we have to think about in the for the future moving forward. I don't know. I don't want to use the term like restore because that sounds a little too trad for my liking. I'm not against trad, by the way, because I find it to be reprehensible. I'm against.
Well, you have a huge trad fan base, by the way. I'm not sure if you know that.
I don't really. I really have no sense for this kind of stuff. I'm going to do that typical female thing where I deflect away all.
Yes, right.
But I'm not against it because it's reprehensible. I'm against it because it's impracticable. But we were talking about this a little bit about how. Even rich people now live under this kind of regime of aesthetic poverty now.
Yes.
They're so like aesthetically malnourished. They don't understand quality or luxury except as like a direct monetary exchange. The more it costs, the more luxurious it must be. I know people who are like famous and or millionaires, and they live in like overpriced open plan, like austerity masquerading as decadence, where they get
masquerading as decadence.
Yeah, I mean they get you.
True.
They get you like on the finishes and the amenities, but like her building is like the layout is perilous and inhumane, and the building is like built on like an Indian burial ground or like a toxic spillage site or something.
Yeah,
and like I want to try to figure out how to bring back the good points of that model. I was watching, going back to the comment that I made on like GATT and NAFTA, I was watching an old episode of Charlie Rose, and he was interviewing Sir James Goldsmith. I don't know if you're familiar with this guy. He was an old school corporate raider who did an about face, kind of, as I'm assuming his personal fortunes took a nosedive, and started agitating against free trade and globalization toward the end of his life. he's a really brilliant, articulate guy. But he on that program, he talks about kind of the existential threat of GATT and NAFTA. Everyone focuses on NAFTA, but he's more interested in GATT because it's the bigger, more wide-ranging, more dangerous trade agreement. And he proposes, this is 1994, again, the year that Revolt of the Elites is published. He proposes submitting it to a referendum, and he talks about how in countries like France and the UK, 30% are for it and 70% are against it. I'm sure you guys can figure out what the class distribution of that percentage breakdown
Yes, of course.
is, and it's probably not much different from what we're looking at now. And he's kind of almost like reprising Peter Thiel's argument, or introducing Peter Thiel's argument 15 years earlier. But the thing that I remember, like I was like sitting in the car, on a long drive, and you can see, like, revisiting this interview like 30 years later, that this referendum, I mean, there was in fact a referendum, but it was delayed. I mean, what is Brexit, right, if not a delayed referendum on the GATT trade agreement? And so I go back to, like, I watch these old episodes of like Charlie Rose, and I think, like, man, this is what like TV used to be. I long for the era of like Gore Vidal versus William F. Buckley. You can't have Gore Vidal now. We don't even deserve William F. Buckley, right? Because, you look at all the media gays and they're like shilling for Pfizer. And like,
so this is, I have to ask you this, then we really will let you go.
Yeah.
Part of the shtick of long form podcast people is that actually, Anna, we are getting back to that. And there's this whole intellectual dark web, and Joe Rogan goes for 5 hours. So actually we are living this age where you can have these debates. What do you think about that argument? Because it doesn't seem like you're optimistic about the format.
Well, I'd kick that question to you. What do you guys think about it? Are you optimistic about it?
Well, this is and this is why I love how you talked about like naivete earlier on, because when you talk to people who extol this format and extol the conversations that we're having outside the mainstream media, and unlike Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity, the people who listen to our podcasts want to be told the capital T truth. It's bullshit. It's actually just not true. It's unclear to me that anyone in any of these spaces has actually constructed a narrative that isn't mostly just self-serving to the audience. I mean, this is the nature of sort of the Patreon economy, right? Which is that the objective isn't to get 30 million people to listen to you. It's to get 50,000 people to pay. It's to get, 10,000 to sort of, those sort of dynamics there. So I like Joe Rogan. I like the show. Insert statement about that. It's been huge for this show's growth, but let's not pretend that Joe isn't also serving his own narrative that helps his audience too. But Sagar, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, this is tough because, I mean, what you're talking about there, that Charlie Rose, like Gore Vidal, Buckley, it was such a unique, like, market moment in time. And I think about, too, just like, look, I mean, like I said, I should be self-serving, like, yeah, alternative media, like, destroying the MSM. Like, look, I'm gonna be honest here. Like, it's just not true. Like, I want it to be true. I would love to solve that economic problem, but I'm not. Like, 12 million people watched CNN. Only 1.5 million people watched my election live stream. 1.5 million is still a lot, but it's not 12 million, or it's not like 20 million whenever it comes to Fox. And so I'm like, okay, well, for every, they literally have a 12x multiplier on their power and like what they have, and in terms of where it is right now. And for every person, I think about this too. I'm like, for every person who listens to Rogan or like listens to this pod or listens to your pod or long form, like all of that, like most people just want like a 5-second clip on Instagram, of like, and I'm like, I don't know if you can ever compete with that. I really don't.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm still waiting. I mean, maybe I'll make an appeal on your podcast to my simps and pay pigs that if anybody wants to write like a Vox style explainer of the electoral fraud that may or may not have occurred, I'm all ears. I would really like to understand it. But
right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think like what we're doing is probably useful and fulfilling on some level for people. I get a lot of messages that are like, between the ones asking me if I've gotten work done, or screaming at me that I should just come out and say that I'm MAGA. I get a lot of messages saying like, okay, like you and Dasha are the only people keeping me sane right now. But on the other hand, I'm not super optimistic. I don't hold out more hope, and it's through no fault of our own. I think the whole model has changed because there's such a surfeit of information and everything is so attention-based that even kind of the nature of popularity or visibility, or if you want to be crude about it, like fame, it has changed. Even if you are extremely visible and influential, it never quite takes hold. And it's always somewhat fleeting and forgettable. Yeah. And so when I say, like, you know, I want to go back to the days when people are having legible and exciting discussions about trade agreements on public programming, I want to figure out moving forward, like that's my hope for the future, how to extract kind of the high points, the benefits of that old model and reapply them today, how to, you know, update them. And, you know, I have a lot of questions now, whether it's possible to create a new institutional framework from the ground up, and how you could avoid that institutional framework from becoming just another kind of site of internecine squabbling and warfare and callouts.
Such a good point.
And that's, I'm happy we're ending there, because we talked about the abyss. And I think that is a semi sort of moment for hope here, because we talk about the future of media a lot. You talk about media, especially with, you know, talking with Glenn about going to Substack. It is possible to cheaply do this. Like, this podcast we're recording isn't the most expensive thing in the world. I actually worked on the PBS reboot of Firing Line 2 years ago, which is, you know, something that cost, you know, millions of dollars to put together, getting the same sorts of guests that we're getting here. So I think this is something that people can be optimistic about and not just think that we're doomed.
No, I guess my last word, my question is whether any sort of extra institutional movement could ever have any real lasting impact, and whether it needs an institutional infrastructure to achieve that. Anyway.
No, that's such a... Well, we can't actually... We got to keep going for that one, because that's a good question. Here's the answer. Yeah, and here's the answer. It has to take power seriously, which this goes back to your earlier point. I'm thinking about, there's this guy who listens to Rising. He invited me on his podcast to talk about these sort of issues, and he's talking about the DNC, and he's talking about conspiracies and all these sort of things. I said, hey, like, just so you know, like, Joe Biden actually won more popular votes in the South. Like, there isn't this crazy dynamic here. And he was just sort of floored by it. He didn't really have a compelling response. He said, but Marshall, the super delegates. I'm like, no, that's a 2016 thing. You're confusing 2016 narratives with 2020 narratives. Mm-hmm. So what he was doing here, and I like this person, is he was not taking power seriously. And he was engaging in narrative discussion rather than actually engaging with anything on the ground. So the reason why you're not going to see people who hold that opinion take power or seriously change the discussion is they're more interested in having internally facing discussions. And it does matter that this is happening on a podcast. It does matter that the typical response from a guest like me would have been, yeah, dude, I totally agree, man. The left is just so corrupt and the right is so corrupt and we're all just so corrupt, except for our audiences. That's why it doesn't happen. That's the doom loop everyone gets caught in.
Yeah. To be fair, I still don't know what a super delegate is or what Super Tuesday is, so you might want to rephrase.
What do you
that
need
question.
to? You're much better off than we are. I just want to put that out there.
Yeah.
Okay, I love this episode. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. Seriously.
See you guys in hell.
Yeah, thank you.
Into the abyss. Let's go.